I believe we will quickly have someone speak about the Spanish translation available for today's workshop. Is that correct?
That is correct. Aldo, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I was waiting for your cue. Thank you, Chris. Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por acompañarnos en esta reunión. Esta reunión se llevará a cabo en inglés. Sin embargo, se proporcionarán servicios de interpretación. Si gusta escuchar esta reunión en español, favor de ir a la parte inferior de su pantalla. Verá un icono en forma de un mundo. Favor de presionar ese mundo y usted va a elegir, en este caso, español o Spanish. Volverá a hacerle clic a ese icono del mundo y va a silenciar el audio original. Si tiene alguna pregunta o duda o dificultad, favor de escribirlo en el chat y con mucho gusto lo apoyaremos. Gracias por acompañarnos. Que tengan una buena reunión. Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Karina Herrera, and I'm an environmental scientist with the State Water Board's Office of Research Planning and Performance. This is the second of several workshops the State Water Board will be hosting on forthcoming water efficiency standards. The purpose of today's meeting is to share the methods being used to evaluate the potential impacts the efficiency standards may have on parklands and urban trees. So we'd love to get started with getting to know who is in the room. So if you could please just take a moment to introduce yourself via chat by entering your name and the group or organization you're representing. We'd greatly appreciate it. And while folks are doing that, let me introduce our team. The Climate and Conservation Team is in the State Water Board's Office of Research, Planning, and Performance. We're a small team working on many projects. We're the team managing the 1668-606 implementation at the State Water Board. We're also the group leading the water loss regulation, implementing the board's climate change resolution, and managing the monthly production and conservation data set. Today, I'm joined by Paula Gonzalez and Charlotte Ely. And let's see, I believe we're also joined by board member Nicole Morgan. If you are present, would you like to say a few words? Okay, perhaps she's not with us yet. Okay. And so right now I'll hand it off to Eric. If you could please introduce yourself and today's presenters.
Thanks, Karina. My name's Eric Porce. I'm with the Office of Water Programs at Sacramento State and UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And I'll quickly introduce our speakers for today, and I'll introduce the whole team that's been working on this component of the project in a little bit as we start our slides. So today we'll have presenting myself and Dr. Joanna Solons at UC Davis, a postdoctoral researcher at UC Davis, Julia Scroven with the UCLA California Center for Sustainable Communities, as well as Rob Cudd at UCLA's California Center for Sustainable Communities. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. And it looks like board member Morgan is here. So if we can try again, let's see if you're able to speak, board member.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to welcome everyone to this afternoon's workshop. Happy to see so many participating. So we're looking forward to hearing from staff, but then also even more important, hearing from you all. So please, if you can, stick with us. There'll be opportunity later in the afternoon for you all to ask questions, but throughout, please, if you have the time, please also submit them through the chat. So looking forward to today's workshop and looking forward to hearing from everyone.
Great, thank you. And yes, definitely, if questions come up, put them in the chat so you don't forget them. Okay, so just quickly going over today's agenda. First, we'll start off with a quick background on the legislation, the outdoor standards, and 10609.2 requirements. We'll then hand it off to Eric and the team to go over the methods being used to evaluate the efficiency standards effects on parklands and urban tree health. It'll be followed by a short break, and after that, we'll go over our planned schedule, allow time for questions, and then close it up with next steps. So in 2018, the California State Legislature enacted two bills, Senate Bill 606 and Assembly Bill 1668. These bills established a new foundation for long-term improvements in water conservation and drought planning to adapt to climate change and the resulting longer and more intense droughts in California. The two bills amended existing law to provide expanded and new authorities and requirements to enable permanent changes and actions for those purposes, improving the state's water future for generations to come. Since 1668 and 606 passed, the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Board have been closely coordinating to carry out the statute's directives. DWR was directed to conduct studies and provide recommendations to the State Water Board. And DWR anticipates providing these recommendations to the State Water Board this winter. The State Water Board was directed to adopt new efficiency standards by summer of 2022. And under the adopted standards, each urban retail water supplier will annually, beginning in 2024, calculate what's called an urban water use objective. Based on the water needed in its service area for efficient indoor residential water use, outdoor residential water use, commercial, industrial, and institutional irrigation with dedicated meters, and reasonable amounts of system water loss, along with consideration of unique local uses and a bonus incentive or credit for potable water reuse. So here is an infographic showing generally how the objective would be calculated. Urban retail water suppliers will use the efficiency standards to calculate their water use objective. And again, this objective will be comprised of standards for residential indoor, residential landscapes, commercial, industrial, and institutional landscapes with dedicated irrigation meters, variances for unique local conditions, and a bonus incentive for direct potable recycled water. Today, we're focusing on the standards that could affect urban trees and parklands, and those are the standards enclosed in red boxes. To give a quick overview for those of you on the workshop who may be new to the conservation framework, again, the two standards that affect outdoor water use are the residential outdoor and the standard for CI&I landscapes with dedicated irrigation meters. Both of these standards will be expressed as evapotranspiration factors that decline over time. Additionally, the framework will set performance measures for CI&I customers. It will set a minimum size threshold for adding a dedicated irrigation meter or in-lieu technology, as well as best management practices for those CI&I customers exceeding that threshold. So what is an evapotranspiration factor? The outdoor standards shall incorporate the principles of the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance. So in order for a water supplier to calculate their outdoor water use budget, they'll need to account for reference evapotranspiration, which is the standard measure of environmental parameters which affect the water use of plants. ETO is an estimate of the evapotranspiration of well-watered cool season grass. Effective precipitation is the portion of total precipitation which becomes available for plant growth. And the evapotranspiration factor is the factor applied to that reference evapotranspiration that adjusts for a plant's water needs and irrigation efficiencies. Landscape area and the unit conversion are the last factors. And the unit conversion factor is just to get the outdoor water use in gallons. So intertwined with the regular rulemaking process is an independent legislative requirement that the State Water Board consider the proposed efficiency standards effects on local wastewater management developed in natural parklands and urban tree health. So how does 10609.2C fit into the overall process? This infographic from the Making Water Conservation a California Way of Life primer outlines major actions and products required to implement the water use efficiency standards in urban retail water suppliers' annual reporting requirements. And while not included here, 10609.2C is one of the important actions being carried out by the State Water Board, which you see enclosed in the red box. We've been directed to identify these effects by May 30, 2022, and to allow for public comment on the potential effects. At this time, we're planning on both holding a workshop and making a written summary of the findings publicly available. So in order to calculate the potential impacts of the new framework on urban trees and parklands, some of the high-level framing questions we started with for trees are, what tree species are here, as in within the service areas of urban retail water suppliers? How much water do they use? And where might changes in water use affect urban tree health? For parklands, what parklands might be affected, and what resources do park managers have to increase water use efficiency? Before diving into the methods, we'd like to hear from you. In the chat, if in just a couple of words, you could describe what your vision for water efficient and climate resilient landscapes in your community are. And we thank you ahead for your thoughts. And it also looks like we might have comments from other people. Charlotte, follow update.
Hey, Karina.
Yes.
Board member Didi is online, would like to add a few comments. Board member Didi, I'm now asking you to unmute.
Hi, just a second. I'm getting situated here. I just joined. Oh, bad lighting. But anyway, thank you for the opportunity to just give me a few minutes to welcome everyone. I'm really excited about this opportunity to listen and learn. Our staff has been doing a lot of work with the Department of Water Resources on the urban water efficiency standards, as you've seen here, on indoor, outdoor, and on water loss. improvements. And I have been in particular really looking at this issue of the urban landscape, trees and parkways. And it's something that I've taken a personal interest in and have spent a lot of time with our staff, but I just really want to make sure that we get it right. And so I'm excited to hear from those that have a technical background in this area, but then also those that have, maybe creative ideas about things that we can do to better assess impacts and provide for mitigation so that we can really move California to the most efficient systems as possible, but at the same time, not end up with some unintended consequences. So thank you all for participating. I see that there's a lot of folks that have tuned in. So I'll go on mute now and hear what you all have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair De Atmo. Karina, please continue.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for all the chat responses. We would like to share the climate and conservation team's vision for the future. Our team's vision includes having California use less water to create and maintain healthy urban landscapes now and in the future, as well as expanding the urban forest canopy overall, but especially within historically marginalized communities. Trees embody a multiple benefits, including reducing the urban heat island effect, reducing stormwater, and sequestering carbon. And we want this new framework to achieve both water use efficiency and the growth of healthy urban forests. So why does efficiency matter? Water efficiency is vital for California's long-term drought planning and climate resilience. It can result in water savings, energy savings, reduced water bills, and protects water quality. We want these standards to be developed and implemented with water equity at the forefront, because we know not everyone uses water the same, and not everyone pays the same for water. But we also acknowledge the limitations of this rulemaking. While the rulemaking will directly apply to urban retail water suppliers, the impacts are broad. Water efficiency requires a greater coalition, greater public involvement. And so we're really looking forward to hearing your input on what our researchers will be presenting today. And with that, I'll hand it off to Eric.
Thanks very much, Karina. As I mentioned previously, my name is Eric Porce. I'm a research engineer with the Office of Water Programs and an assistant adjunct professor at UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, Dr. Joanna Sollins, a postdoctoral researcher at UC Davis, Julia Scroven, a researcher at UCLA's California Center for Sustainable Communities, and Rob Cudd, a researcher at UCLA's California Center for Sustainable Communities. So as was hinted at earlier, but just to clarify, today's webinar is the second of two webinars. The prior webinar happened yesterday. Yesterday, we spoke a lot about the process to evaluate urban retail water supplier effects based on the objective calculations, scenarios of objectives, and forecasted demand. We will briefly discuss that today, but refer you to yesterday's presentation for more details. And yesterday, we also heard from our process engineering expert team as part of this project too. So we won't be covering wastewater today. We'll be covering, we're focusing on the effects on urban trees and parklands. Next slide. The full project scope for our university team, which you'll get to introduce, which you'll get to meet fully in a second, includes evaluating the economic and environmental effects from AB 1668 SD 606 for several key areas. And these include effects on urban retail water suppliers, including a cost and benefit assessment, as well as effects on low-income communities and across different regions. We're also evaluating the effects on wastewater management, including conveyance, treatment, and reuse. Potential effects include odor and corrosion, water quality, recycled water production potential, and others. We're evaluating potential effects on developed and natural parklands within the service areas. These could include the effects of irrigation regimes on vegetation and other constraints that influence park managers' opportunities to manage water efficiently, and we'll hear more about that today, of course. And then finally, effects on urban trees, including the risks for urban trees associated with changes in outdoor water use, which we'll hear about in detail today as well. Next. I'm going to take an extended minute here to be sure to introduce the full project team. Yesterday, I especially introduced the folks on our team who have been working on the wastewater management side, and today I'll focus more on the folks who've been working on the landscape management side. So since November 2019, we've been working under the guise of a university model agreement to support the economic and environmental assessment from AB 1668 and SB 606 through a multi-university team that includes Sacramento State, led by the Office of Water Programs as the overall contract lead, as well as the Department of Economics and the Department of Civil Engineering. At UCLA and UC Davis, they've been particularly in charge of leading the task for today's topics. And at UCLA, our co-PI, my colleague Stephanie Pinsettle, who is a professor at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability and the director of the California Center for Sustainable Communities, and Stephanie's been working on these topics for multiple decades. We also have, within Stephanie's lab, you'll hear from several researchers today, including Rob Cudd and Julia Scroven. In addition, Stephanie's lab has also been working for many years on visualizations. And so another component of the project, which we won't discuss today, is the development of a visualization tool around these potential effects across the state. And that's been led by Lauren Strug and Hannah Gustafson, who are researchers within CCSC. And at UCLA as well, we also have a co-PI, Dr. Lauren Sack, who has specialties in tree physiology and modeling, as well as a PhD candidate, Marvin Brown, and Dr. Felicia Federico with CCSC. UC Davis has been leading the assessment of the evaluation of trees that you'll hear about today, and my colleague Mary Cadenasso is the co-PI. Mary's a landscape and urban ecology specialist, and has run for many years an urban ecology lab there, as well as many other tasks and field work throughout California and elsewhere. One of our lead presenters today is Dr. Joanna Solons, who's a postdoctoral researcher with Dr. Cadenasso's lab, as well as GIS specialist and guru Bogomila Baggio. And then finally, I will introduce again our economics team, composed of Dr. Jonathan Kaplan, here a professor of economics at Sacramento State University, and Dr. Eric Eschker, who is at Humboldt State University and a professor of economics there. Next. Our overall approach for the large-scale scope of the project includes multiple steps. So first, we have to calculate scenarios of objectives based on parameters provided by the state agencies, by the Department of Water Resources and by the State Water Resources Control Board. We can use those parameters to calculate these scenarios, and then we have the task of evaluating current water demand and future water demand. And yesterday I went into more depth about we have to forecast water demand through the course of the implementation of this regulation, which spans through 2030 when the standards are fully implemented. And then we end up in number 3, evaluating suppliers that will need reductions based on the difference between that forecasted demand and the various objective scenarios. Once we have that calculation, we can identify the suppliers that may need to undertake mitigation and adaptation actions for reductions, and then project what those likely compliance actions would be and the effects. And with that information, we can then assess the downstream effects for sectors such as wastewater management and landscapes, and we're focusing on the landscapes analysis here today. Next. Our overall framework for evaluating this considers what the difference between the objective and the forecasted use is in several different bins. So in the top graph, you can see that the objective value is greater than actual use for a given supplier. And in this case, there would be no necessary actions for compliance, and there would be no new economic and environmental effects. In the middle graph, you can see that where the objective is essentially equal to actual use, and in this case, limited to no compliance actions would be necessary, and therefore limited to no economic environmental effects would be applied. And then finally, in the bottom graph, you can see where the bar on the right, where the objective value is less than the bar on the left, the objective value is less than the bar on the right with the actual use. And you can see in the shaded region a quantity of interest, and this is the quantity of interest that a supplier would need to reduce to come into compliance with the standards set through the AB 1668 SB 606 policies. And in this case, this is where our team is assessing the effects based on likely mitigation actions for compliance. And in addition, per our contract and the statutory requirements, as Karina mentioned, then the effects on the downstream systems. Next. I spoke about this in more detail yesterday, so I'll highlight it here. A new component that we've been discussing this week as part of this analysis is introducing the idea of baseline conditions, and in particular, baseline conditions in the future. So we can evaluate what standards would be against current demand, but we also have to evaluate what standards would be for future demand. And in order to do this, we have to undertake a demand forecasting exercise for suppliers throughout the state. And these would include baseline conditions such as ongoing efficiency and population change, as well as climate and drought that we know are the case in California. So we use those to evaluate a baseline future demand, and that future demand is what's compared to the scenarios of the objectives. And the objective parameters we follow from guidance from the state agencies include the indoor standard, the outdoor standard, and volumetric values for the other volumes included in the standard, including variances, recycled bonuses, and leak losses. Once we compare the future demand to the scenarios of the objectives, then we can evaluate the effects of the regulations and for the period of full implementation in the future. And we can identify suppliers that would likely need to undertake reductions for compliance and the effects of the downstream systems. And for those suppliers, then we have to project and assess what the mitigation and adaptation options would be. And these might include a suite of typical tools that suppliers use for water demand management, including rebates and incentives, codes and restrictions, education and outreach, and rates. In order to assess what actions would be taken, we've been using a lot of different strategies. These include understanding what saturation rates are of efficient fixtures that might limit opportunities for indoor incentive-based water use efficiency improvements. Could also include community constraints such as size and income that would influence the opportunities for water use, water demand management opportunities. Also, we conduct an extensive process to outreach with suppliers to hear about actions that have been taken to date and may be taken in the future, preferential actions if compliance actions were required. And then finally, as part of the economic assessment, considering demand management options, benefits, and costs of various opportunities for increasing water use efficiency and improving conservation in the future when necessary. Next slide. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Joanna Solins, who will speak about the modeling procedure for evaluating effects on urban tree canopy.
Thank you, Eric. So in this portion of the presentation, I'll be describing the approach that we took to evaluating the effects of the new standards on urban trees. And the way the legislation is written, we're specifically focused on trees in residential areas. So broadly, our approach was to start by estimating the water demand of urban residential vegetation, or to put that another way, to calculate the amount of water that existing residential vegetation would use under fully irrigated conditions. This meant first defining residential areas within supplier boundaries, and then calculating how much of those areas are covered by trees and turf, which are the two primary components of urban vegetation. And because different trees use different amounts of water, we also evaluated tree species and size distributions across the state. And finally, used all of that information to calculate water demand using equations developed from field studies that measured the actual water use of different trees and turf. We can then compare the vegetation water demand to current water use and then to predicted changes in water use under scenarios for the new objectives. And with that information, we can evaluate the risks for each supplier. Reductions in outdoor water use below vegetation demand potentially pose risks to tree health if people respond to the new standards by reducing irrigation to trees. Next slide, please. So there are a number of different methods for calculating vegetation water demand, and I wanted to briefly explain why we landed on the approach that we took. I imagine many of you are familiar with MWELO, the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, which sets standards for the efficiency of new landscapes. And while this method works for its intended purpose, it requires too much fine-scale information for us to use it on a statewide scale for existing vegetation. And for anyone who's worked with agricultural or natural systems, you may be familiar with remote sensing techniques to estimate landscape evapotranspiration. These methods are challenging to apply to urban areas, but we did pilot 2 of the most promising remote sensing products, EcoStress and BESS, to see if they could work for our needs. Unfortunately, we found that they were simply not accurate enough in California's cities. So finally, we tested a bottom-up approach that's based on measurements of plant transpiration, and we found that this method was much more robust, so we decided to pursue it. However, it does require a considerable amount of data, which I'll go into next. So next slide, please. For this bottom-up method, we used the work of researchers in Los Angeles who developed equations for tree and turf water demand based on field studies that related plant water use to environmental variables and also to characteristics of the plants. So for trees, these equations require us to know what types of trees are in an area in 3 broad categories of trees with different water use, and then how many of these trees there are and the sapwood area of those trees. Sapwood is the part of the tree's trunk that transports water, so it varies with tree size and also by species. And for trees, the environmental variables that they found predicted water use were vapor pressure deficit and solar radiation. For turf, we need to know the total area covered by turf, and then also the proportion of that area that's shaded, because shaded turf uses less water than unshaded turf. And for turf, water use is related to reference evapotranspiration. Next slide. The first step in calculating residential vegetation water demand is to determine how much residential area is actually covered by vegetation, and then what proportion of that vegetated area is tree canopy versus unshaded turf. Next, please. So we first defined residential areas by aggregating residential parcels within each supplier's boundaries. However, there are lots of trees planted in front of houses whose canopies extend beyond the parcel over the street. So to capture that canopy area, we included a 10-meter buffer around the residential parcels. So you can see in this image that the residential area extends into the streets. And in this case, the streets are narrow enough that in most places, we just have a continuous residential area. However, we didn't want to include trees that were growing on adjacent non-residential parcels like the school that's shown in this figure. So we clipped those parcels out of the buffer. And in total, 384 suppliers had parcel data with adequate information for us to create these residential areas. Next. To determine the total vegetated area within the residential areas, we use the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI, which quantifies the amount of living vegetation by measuring the difference between near-infrared light, which living vegetation strongly reflects, and red light, which living vegetation absorbs. We calculated NDVI using NAPE imagery, which has a 0.6 meter resolution, so it's a very fine resolution. And we used a standard value of 0.2 to distinguish vegetation. So this example on the right shows the same area of Sunnyvale, just as an example, with imagery on the top and then with the NDVI values overlaid below. And the green and DVI values represent vegetation, while orange and red are impervious surfaces and water. And then the gray areas of imagery you can see poking through are wide streets that fell outside the residential parcel buffer. Next slide. So now we have the total vegetated area, but we need to know how much of that vegetation is tree canopy, which is challenging to distinguish. But luckily, we have access to an urban tree canopy layer that was created by EarthDefine. EarthDefine has mapped tree canopy across the United States, and the 2018 urban tree canopy for the state of California has been made publicly available through the US Forest Service and CAL FIRE. And this canopy layer was created using artificial intelligence to recognize trees based on aerial imagery, and it was found to be 97.3% accurate in urban areas across the country. Next slide. Unfortunately, this canopy layer doesn't cover all of the residential areas within supplier boundaries. So to estimate canopy cover in areas without data, we used point estimates. So we created random points within the areas that had no canopy data, and we used NAPE imagery to determine whether the point fell on tree canopy or not, so that we could get a % canopy estimate. This is a very labor-intensive process, so we prioritize suppliers with greater missing areas. For suppliers with less than 10% of their area missing canopy data, we assumed that the area with missing canopy had the same % canopy cover as the rest of the residential area, because that would have been within our error in the point estimates. And then for suppliers with 10 to 25% missing canopy data, we made an estimate using 100 points. And for suppliers missing more than 25% of their data, we used 250 points so that we could get increased certainty in our estimates. Next slide. So once we have the total vegetated area and canopy area, we have all of the available information to calculate the water demand of turf. And research from Los Angeles showed that the water demand of turf when fully irrigated didn't actually depend on the turf grass variety, but only on whether or not it was shaded and the environmental conditions. So our equation for turf consists of a microclimate coefficient, this KMC, and that's taken times the reference evapotranspiration. And to calculate KMC, we need to know the unshaded and shaded amount of turf. So first, to estimate the area of unshaded turf, we take the total vegetated area and subtract the canopy area. And then shaded turf is a little trickier because we can't actually know for sure what's under the tree canopy. For our mean estimates, we're assuming that 50% of the area under tree canopy is turf, but we're also calculating a range from 25% to 75%. And shaded turf doesn't use as much water, so this uncertainty doesn't actually have as huge an effect on total turf water demand estimates as you might think. So the total turf area is then the shaded area plus the unshaded area. And this equation for calculating the microclimate coefficient was determined from the field studies. And then finally, we're using spatial CIMMYS data for reference evapotranspiration for the years 2014 to 2019. And I just wanted to acknowledge that this method assumes that all non-canopy vegetation is turf, which we know is not actually true. However, it's very close to the truth in many places. And more importantly, it gives us an idea of the maximum water demand we could expect from non-canopy vegetation in any given area. Next, please. So the next step is to calculate the water demand of trees, which is a bit more complicated. So as I mentioned, this method groups trees into 3 different types that have different water use patterns: broadleaf trees, conifers, and palms. And water demand is the sum of transpiration, or E, for these 3 different components, each of which has its own equation. So overall, for each supplier, we need to know the total number of residential trees, the relative abundance of each species, as well as its size distribution, which is based on the diameter at breast height, or DBH, which is a standard measure of how large a tree's trunk is. We also need to know which of the 3 types each species is and whether it's deciduous or evergreen. And then for broadleaf trees and conifers, we also need to know the mean sapwood area. And finally, we need to know the monthly average vapor pressure deficit and solar radiation values. So that's a lot of information, and I want to show you how it all fits together. Next slide, please. This diagram shows the tree water demand modeling process we used, and it organizes the rest of this part of the presentation. So I will go through it as an overview, and then I'll be digging into the different components individually. In this diagram, the green bubbles are data inputs, the gray are intermediate steps, and then the blue bubbles represent information that feeds directly into the transpiration equations. So starting on the left, we relied on tree inventories from both public and private sources to evaluate the relative abundance of different urban tree species and their size distributions. Then using this information, we were able to calculate the average tree crown area for each supplier based on models that we developed. This tree crown area is the average amount of canopy occupied by one tree. So if we divide the total tree canopy area by the average crown area, we get an estimate of the total number of trees. And then using the relative abundance data from the inventories, we can then get an estimate of the density of each species, which feeds into the equations. We also estimated models to relate DBH to sapwood area for different species. And we classified species into types and determined whether they were deciduous or evergreen using trait data from the Select Tree database, which has been assembled by our colleagues at Cal Poly. And finally, we calculated vapor pressure deficit and solar radiation for each supplier based on, again, on spatial CIMMYS data from the years 2014 to 2019. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we gathered tree inventories from public data sources, primarily municipal websites, and also from private tree companies through a data set that's been collected by, again, by our colleagues at Cal Poly. And we merged these different data sources together and subset the trees that were within our residential areas. And we ended up with over 3.5 million trees statewide. And these trees weren't evenly distributed, so some suppliers had adequate inventory and some did not. This map here shows 6 different climate zones in California as defined by the US Forest Service. And you can see that the Southern California coast region, which is in this sort of orangey tan color, has nearly 1.5 million trees, while the darker green interior west region has fewer than 10,000 urban trees. Correspondingly, in the table, most of the retailers in the Southern California coast region had adequate inventory data, which we've defined as at least 2,000 trees and at least 2 trees per hectare. While in contrast, none of those in the interior west region did. So for suppliers with data, we simply used their tree inventories, but for those without data, we had to make predictions, which I'll talk about later. And for the interior west and southwest desert regions, there were so few trees within residential areas of suppliers that we used all inventoried urban trees for predictions in these areas, which is what the asterisks on this map refer to. So in total, 223 suppliers had inventory data that we could use and 161 did not. Next slide. Our next step was to determine the total number of trees based on the mean crown area of trees in a given area. So we created equations to relate DBH to crown area using a data set from the US Forest Service that measured both DBH and tree crown dimensions for several thousand urban trees across the state of California. So these equations that we developed are shown in the graphs on the right, which have crown area on the y-axis and DBH on the x-axis. For broadleaf trees, there were enough data points that we were able to run separate models for 4 of the climate zones. And then for conifers, we lumped all the trees from different climate zones together, but we did pull out one very common species, Cupressus sempervirens, or Italian cypress, because it has a much narrower crown than most species. And it made up a substantial portion of the data. So then using these equations, we calculated the crown area for each tree in an inventory and then took the mean value for each supplier. And then the total number of trees is the total canopy area divided by the mean crown area. And then the density of any given species I is the total number of trees times its relative abundance. So just as an example, if we found that there were a total of 100 trees per hectare for one supplier, and 7% of the trees in the inventory were crepe myrtles, we'd say that the density of crepe myrtles was 7 trees per hectare. Next slide, please. We also created equations relating sapwood area, which is shown on the y-axis here, to DBH, which is shown on the x-axis. Different species have very different relationships between DBH and sapwood area, and we wanted to remove as much of this uncertainty as we could. So we were able to use the original data from the transpiration studies in Los Angeles, and then we also did a literature search for the 200 most common species in the inventories to add data where we could. We were able to develop species-specific equations for 37 common species that represent over 30% of all trees in the inventory. And then for other species, we developed mean, maximum, and minimum equations to predict sapwood area based on all of the available data. So for species without individual equations, the uncertainty is much greater. Next slide, please. So finally, we can implement the transpiration equations. And this looks like a lot, but it's not that complicated. So for both broadleaf trees and conifers, the equations are actually exactly the same, except for a constant that's specific to each type of tree. So transpiration, or E, of a given species I is a function of its density and its sapwood area and the monthly vapor pressure deficit and solar radiation values for the supplier in which it's located. And then for deciduous trees, we set transpiration to 0 during months when the trees are leafless. And for most areas of the state, we considered November through February to be leafless months. The equation for palm trees is simpler as they have a different physiology and it's based purely on their density. So then the total transpiration of trees, or E trees, is the sum of all the broadleaf species plus the sum of the conifers and then the transpiration of palms. Next, please. So for suppliers without tree inventory data, we needed predictions of their urban forest composition. We first looked at whether tree inventories within climate zones were similar to one another, and that's focusing on the 4 climate zones that had a lot of tree data. So this plot shows the results of a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination, and this simply evaluates how similar the species compositions of different areas are. So each dot on the plot represents one supplier with inventory data, and the closer together the dots are, the more similar the inventories are. The colors match the climate zones on the map, and we can see that suppliers within the same climate zone tend to have relatively similar urban forest composition. So we decided to model unknown urban forests within these climate zones. Next, please. To get better predictions for each supplier, we modeled urban forest composition using a joint species distribution modeling technique, which is known as the hierarchical modeling of species communities framework. It's a bit of a mouthful. This technique allows us to use information about sites and the traits of tree species as predictors to model urban tree inventory composition. And it also considers the spatial relationships among different sites. So we wanted to be able to use both sociodemographic and climate variables as predictors. So we ran these models at the zip code level, including data such as income, race, and development age from the American Community Survey, or ACS. We ran models within each climate zone, but we also included a buffer of adjoining zip codes from other climate zones. And models included the most common species in each climate zone, which was typically around or more than 100 species. We made sure that these species made up 95% of the total trees. And we included zip codes with at least 2,000 residential trees and at least 2 trees per hectare. Next slide, please. So each model creates predictions of urban forest composition for all zip codes in that climate zone based on the zip code characteristics. And the model actually makes predictions for each individual species. So this graph is just an example. It shows the first dozen species alphabetically from the Inland Valleys model. And it shows the proportion of the variation in their distributions that's explained by different types of predictors in the model. So species with a large portion of green in this graph are more strongly related to sociodemographic variables, while species with a large portion of light blue are more strongly related to climate variables. And then those with a lot of dark blue in their bar have strong spatial structuring. So this is just to show that all of the different types of site variables that we used as predictors were quite important for predicting different species. Unfortunately, we can't just use straight predictions of relative abundance from the models because we also need size distributions for all of the species, and we can't model those two things at the same time. So for each zip code without data that we were trying to predict, we used its predicted urban forest composition to find similar zip codes with data, and we did this based on the Bray-Curtis dissimilarity metric. And then we calculated trees for all of these similar zip codes using the supplier's climate data in which that unknown zip code was located. And so that gives us a mean value and also a range of predictions for that zip code. And then we can get a weighted mean value for each supplier based on the proportion of its area occupied by each zip code. So then we have also a minimum and maximum range of values from all of the different predictor zip codes because there's clearly greater uncertainty for these areas. All right, next slide, please. So once we have our estimates of vegetation water demand, we can compare them to current water use and the new objectives. So these graphs show fictional hypothetical water use data for a few made up suppliers, just as an example. So the y-axis is water use in gallons per capita per day. The red bar shows current water use as reported deliveries. The blue bar is current outdoor water use, and then the green bar is vegetation water demand comprised of both trees in the darker green and turf in the lighter green. And then the dotted line shows the new hypothetical objective. So in this case, supplier A is already below its objective, so there's no risk to its trees from the legislation. Its outdoor water use is slightly below the vegetation water demand, and in this case, the difference could be made up by precipitation. Supplier B will have to cut water use to meet the new objectives, but it appears that current water use is actually greater than what the vegetation requires. So cutting outdoor water use by improving outdoor water use efficiency should allow supplier B to meet its objective without negatively impacting trees. And then in the third case, supplier C will need to reduce water use, but the current outdoor water use is already efficient compared to vegetation demand. So if cuts were to come primarily from outdoor water use, trees could be at risk from reduced water availability. However, we can also see that a lot of the vegetation water demand is from turf. So if turf were replaced with low water use vegetation or other ground covers, there could still be plenty of water available for trees. Next, please. So that last slide gave a sense of how we'll assess risks to residential trees, but to put it more concretely, we'll first consider whether a reduction in water use will be needed to meet the new objective. If not, there's no additional risk from the legislation. Second, if a reduction is needed, does vegetation water demand exceed the projected outdoor water use? And we also consider whether tree water demand alone exceeds outdoor water use, and also whether it's likely that trees are accessing non-irrigation water sources, such as groundwater. And then third, could precipitation actually fill the deficit? So it's very difficult to know exactly how much of the precipitation that falls in an urban area is available to vegetation, but we can see whether precipitation could possibly provide the difference. Fourth, we can consider what percentage of the trees for a supplier are rated as low water use. So our calculations show how much water trees use when they're fully irrigated, but some trees can live with much less water. And finally, we're looking at future climate scenarios to see whether climate in a given area is expected to become warmer or drier, which would increase the plant water demand and the reliance on irrigation. And at this point, I'm going to pass it on to Julia Scroven, who's going to talk about our Parklands research. So next slide.
Thank you, Joanna. So this is Julia Scrovan. I'm with UCLA, the California Center for Sustainable Communities. I'll start our presentation on the effects on urban parklands. So as part of the assessment, the urban parklands were included as a key group of stakeholders that could be affected by the objective. dependent on the presence of dedicated irrigation meters, Parklands would be included in that commercial, institutional, and industrial outdoor water use portion. So they'd be representing part of that institutional category. Now, in order to evaluate if and how parklands may be affected, the team first evaluated the extent of parklands that lie within the urban retail water supplier boundaries. We then identified park management agencies across the state to serve as case studies. And we conducted outreach and semi-structured interviews with park managers from those case studies. Finally, we analyzed the interview findings. And this was to create a baseline understanding of how water use in parks from different parts of the state may be included in the objective, and also how that may or may not change management and vegetation within those parks. So how adaptation may play out if it were necessary under the new objective. You can go to the next slide, please. So we were able to use the California Protected Areas database, and that's publicly available. It's produced and managed by Green Info Network. And this Parklands database includes large and small urban parks, as well as state and federal parks, preserves, conservation areas, so a real wide range. On the left here in green, it's the entirety of the Parklands database as of their latest release in 2020. And that represents about 50 million acres of land. So the first thing we wanted to do was evaluate how much of that land actually sits within the supplier boundaries. When we intersected the park boundaries with the suppliers, we get about 1,400,000 acres. But it's important to note that this includes both developed and undeveloped parklands managed by the entire range of agencies, so federal to state to local. So here it doesn't represent the most refined or most filtered set of urban parklands that may be supplied by urban retail water suppliers. And next slide, please. So what's really great about this data set is the level of detail given for each park unit. On the right here, you can see an example of a small park in Los Angeles. And the database includes information about the management agency, the type of park, whether it's open access or not. And in some cases, we also have some other details. So the age of the park is sometimes included as well. And I could give some information about the age of irrigation infrastructure, et cetera. So this is incredibly useful for understanding not only the distribution of parks within the supplier boundaries, but also the distribution of the type and the management of those parks. And that also includes an idea of the spread of the developed irrigated parks, as well as those undeveloped or natural unirrigated parks that lie within the supplier boundaries. And next slide. So we use that Parklands database to then identify case studies for outreach. Shown here are the same climate boundaries as you were introduced to by Joanna in the trees analysis. And you can see in the black portion overlying those climate zones are a version of those filtered parklands. Just a note that they're exaggerated a bit here just for the purpose of visibility at the state level. So we wanted to include park management agencies from each of the climate zones, just so we could ensure that we got some variety in terms of irrigation regimes, vegetation, relationships to water availability, types of water sources, and so on. And of course, the terrain and local conditions across the state are incredibly diverse, but these climate zones would help situate some of the comparative conditions. So you can go to the next slide. So the next thing was to narrow in on local parks and local recreation areas at the city and county level. So we did this to target urban park systems and systems that were more certain to have at least some irrigated developed parklands, in addition to any undeveloped or natural parklands. Here you can see an example of about 2 to 4 management agencies within each climate zone. And in that table, you can see some of the things we looked at when choosing case studies. So we have the number of potential suppliers for each example of case study park systems. So these are suppliers that overlap with at least some of the parks within that agency. You can also see the number of park units of that agency that lie within the climate zone, the acres of those park units within the climate zone, and also the percent of park units and park acres that account for all the parks within a particular climate zone or within the entire management city or county. So for instance, we might be interested in looking at a city or county in a climate zone that had a really dense park system to compare to one that had a sparser distribution of parks. So we can understand how they might be affected differently or adapt differently. And one of the things not shown here is population, which we also used when refining the case study agencies. So we suspected that park resources, characteristics like age, climate, expected traffic, that these might all affect not only the irrigation systems that existed in the park, but also the vegetation and the capacity for adaptation in the case that it was necessary. So we were interested in case studies that represented some of the older and larger park systems in California, systems that serve large populations, as well as some of the smaller, newer park systems that serve smaller communities across the climate zones. So now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Rob, and he's going to discuss the development of these case studies through the semi-structured interviews with park managers.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, so in interviewing the park managers and staff, we designed a semi-structured interview, being that we wanted to, well, we had a number of categories of information that we wanted to ask about. So like the ones listed here, the presence of dedicated meters, since the proposed regulations would only apply to dedicated meters. Obviously, the water supply sources, the technology that's used to irrigate parklands of different sorts in different climate zones, and the evaluation of, how what irrigation, the results of irrigation were evaluated. So is that just done by eye, or were there other sensors involved, so on and so forth? And then resources for adaptation. What kind of financial and material resources did parks managers and administration have for or at their disposal to adapt to to deal with drought or to adapt to changing climatic conditions in their particular contexts. So if you can advance the slide forward. So in conducting and analyzing these interviews, we had, like I said, these categories of these questions about sort of the tangible aspects of park management that we wanted to ask about, but also we asked a number of open-ended questions about some of the topics listed below, and compared the answers across the different park case studies that different park case studies we conducted. So including attitudes towards climate change and water scarcity, whether climate change was something people were concerned about, or water scarcity was something they saw as highly problematic and would only become more problematic in the future, or if it was something that they weren't concerned about necessarily long term. What kind of ideas they had about drought tolerant landscaping, what a drought tolerant landscape would look like in a particular climate zone or context, expectations they have for changes in funding amounts, or cuts or expansions to their budget depending on future economic expansion in urban areas, and the desire for closer measurement and rationalization of water consumption for park infrastructure, because that's something that we also thought might vary, considering the scale at which the park systems, the scale of the different park systems sort of studied. So being, as Julia mentioned, there are very, very large urban parks that have hundreds of acres of closely managed and manicured landscapes, and ones that are smaller, and some that aren't irrigated at all. So That that was the process by which we sort of we collected and analyzed the data through our interviews. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Eric Porse.
Thanks, Rob. So today we were discussing the methods and the sort of next steps. We will be implementing all these methods, continue to implement all the methods, and then finalizing it for reports that'll end up constituting a report and a series of detailed technical appendices around the environmental effects assessment that you heard in part today, as well as the economic effects assessment. Those will be turned over to the Water Board, and also the public data associated with this project. We used public data as much as possible, and we hope that that becomes a resource for the communities across California. I do want to take a minute just to provide some special thanks to a number of different communities throughout the state that assisted this work, have assisted it to date, and continue to support it in various questions and providing data and identifying data sources and so forth. So California Water Efficiency Partnership and Alliance for Water Efficiency, Urban Retail Water Supply Community, including many of the regional agencies throughout the state that helped to organize a whole series of semi-structured interviews, as well as these aqua. Wastewater Management Community, including the Clean Water Partners, CASA, SCAP, BACWA, the Central Valley Clean Water Association, and CWEA. As Julia mentioned, the discussions with urban parkland managers throughout the state were extremely beneficial in helping us understand their approaches and their decision-making, as well as a number of colleagues, including at UCLA, Dong-Yi Lee, Ruth Engel, and Dennis Lettenmeyer, within Dennis Lettenmeyer's lab, who helped us with studies of water demand management, as well as Tom Gillespie at UCLA. Matt Ritter and Andrew Fricker at Cal Poly SLO were extremely helpful and as part of this work. And then finally, Diane Pataki and Lisa Litvak as well. With that, I'll turn it back over to the Water Board.
Great, thank you so much. So let's now do a short break. We had planned for 10, but let's just do a quick 5-minute break just to make sure we have enough time to get through everyone's questions. So if we could be back at 3:13. You all done? Hello, hello. Welcome back. Hopefully everyone's able to get a quick stretch. And so now we are going to have Eric do some quick highlights of what was presented today, followed with Paula presenting our planned schedules, and then we'll get to questions. So Eric, go ahead.
Thanks, Karina. So just an attempt to summarize here some of the highlights from the presentation, although certainly not comprehensive of all the data and methods in there, but vegetation demand for trees and turf on residential properties is being estimated for urban areas across the state through this bottom-up approach that was discussed based on experimental data collection and ecological modeling. The tree inventory data, including species composition and size, is being used to evaluate water demand of the existing urban residential tree canopy and differences in tree water demand across climate zones and individual suppliers. A risk-based approach is being used to evaluate potential effects of water demand reductions from AB 1668 SB 606 on urban trees, including comparing modeled vegetation demand with observed outdoor demand for urban retail water suppliers that may face likely reductions for compliance with the regulations. Next. Limited information exists on current water management practices in Parklands, including actual water deliveries for CII dedicated meters. Interviews and outreach were, as a result, conducted with park managers across the state to evaluate existing water and irrigation management habits, as well as sources of data for urban park boundaries. And finally, for cities and counties that manage urban trees and parks in affected areas, based on compiling information from interviews as well as literature, some of the mitigation and adaptation actions we've heard about to deal with climate change and water demand reductions may likely include changing irrigation habits, planting climate-appropriate trees and shrubs, reducing turf, and increasing public education programs regarding the irrigation needs of landscapes. But we continue to compile a whole series of mitigation and adaptation actions as part of evaluating the environmental effects for the regulations, and there will be more work to be done in that regard. Thanks.
Okay, so I will go ahead and quickly cover our planned schedules. Please be reminded that these dates are subject to change. So the State Water Board is planning to release the draft methods document for public comment in February 2022. The comment period will be between February and March, and the board plans to publish the complete wastewater, parklands, and trees draft report for public comment in April of 2022. The staff will then review and address comments between the end of May and July of 2022, and the board plans to publish the final report in September. Next slide, please. So this is the planned schedule for the AB 1668 and SB 606 rulemaking. Again, these dates are subject to change. The board is hoping to receive recommendations from DWR this winter and plan to start the rulemaking process in spring of 2022. Staff plan to bring the rulemaking to our board for adoption in spring of 2023 and would therefore have an effective date that would fall sometime in the fall of 2023. Next slide, please.
So now for questions. So many great questions have been coming in on the chat. If any of you would like to expand, please, or have any other questions, use the hand raise function. So yeah, let's get started.
Hi there. I'm seeing at the very end of the chat that Kim O'Kane had posed a question that a number of people were interested in hearing more about. Kim, do you want to speak to that question? May we unmute you so you can articulate, or if in the chat,
Yeah, great. Thank you so
there
much.
we are.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Well, I just want to thank everyone who's presented today and worked so hard on this, and the staff and the board for offering us an opportunity to download this. It's a lot of information to digest. A lot of people have already commented on that, but it was presented very succinctly. And I had a couple of questions, one specifically relating to MWILO and why your team thought it was not a good idea to use that to determine the formula for existing trees and turf. And then the other one, is there going to be some kind of variance process or bonus water for these disadvantaged or local income communities that are trying to increase their canopy and potentially during that establishment period would be using more water? Thanks.
Thank you, Kim. I can take the first part of that question about MWILO. So there's kind of two reasons for this. First, MWILO really wants, like the formula requires you to know exactly what species are being planted in which proportions across the landscape. And that's very difficult to know at a statewide scale. It also doesn't perform quite so well for understanding tree water use, and not all of the trees in our inventories are included in the WCL's ratings. So that's part of the reason. But the other reason is that because the MWILO framework was used to develop the new standards, we wanted to have an independent approach to assessing the water demand of vegetation. Yeah, and I think I'd have to turn it over to someone at the water board for the second part of that question.
Sure. So to the issue of variances, there were a number of variances that were specifically identified in statute, and a variance for young trees was not something that was specifically called out. It has not been something that the Department of Water Resources has included, in their sort of initial sort of recommendations package that they've shared publicly. That said, there is nothing that would sort of prevent the water board from taking into consideration additional variances aside from those that were identified in statute or even recommended by the department. So I really appreciate your comment there, Kim. I think it's very much worth looking into. So thank you for raising that. Did you have one additional question? I'm looking back at your comments. There was
it was just a comment. Yeah, just separate from the report, but in the proposed drought regulations that you're looking at for the end of this month, there's a mention in there about banning parkway potable water use. And I just want to highlight that in most cases, parkways have one irrigation valve where it irrigates potentially a street tree as well as all the other landscaping that's in there. And by banning that, you could be inadvertently cutting off the water supply to these trees. And that's, providing issues with disease or even death. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and there will be opportunity for public comment for the emergency conservation regulation rulemaking as well on January 4th. I think we're scheduled to, our board is scheduled to adopt it then. So more opportunities to discuss that issue then. You had additionally asked, I think, about whether or not all trees were assumed to be mature, was tree decline due to disease included, was replacement of turf due to increased turf replacement rebates included. And I thought those were good questions, and I'm wondering if the research team could address some of those as well, because I think they could be of interest to other folks on the call.
Sure, I can take a first stab at that. So we did not assume that all trees were mature. So we used the size distributions in the inventories, which, had trees ranging from very small, 1 inch DBH all the way up to very large trees. Unfortunately, just because of the scale of this analysis, we're focused mostly on kind of current vegetation. And again, looking at that kind of maximum water demand we might get from non-canopy vegetation if we assume that what we're seeing is turf. So we don't have enough information about turf replacement across the entire state to include that in our assessment of current water use. But as far as thinking about the risks to trees, that's certainly one of the mitigation processes that we are thinking about. Anyone else can feel free to jump in there.
Thank you, Joanna. Why don't we invite Jessica Sanders to speak next with the Sacramento Tree Foundation. Jessica, you had asked quite a few questions, but please feel free to articulate those now and any others that you might have. It seems like you're very active in this space.
Yeah, sorry. So I have a question that I didn't actually type in the chat. So this modeling all seems to occur at one static time. So if we're starting to account for increase in transpiration, especially in urban areas with urban heat island effect and the increase of impervious surface or change in any dynamics here, that's going to cause more water stress and water strain on trees, especially with the potential decrease of water availability. So I'm curious if the researchers have thought about how urban heat island plays an effect, or how other sort of things, I talked a lot about municipalities have canopy goals or climate goals or resiliency goals, all which water is going to play a part in. So I'm just curious if that's come into any effect at all too.
Yes, so for our current estimates, we are using existing environmental data from Spatial CIMIS. But in thinking of risks in the future, we are looking at future climate projections for what areas are expected to become hotter and drier, whether precipitation patterns are changing. Absolutely. Urban heat island is absolutely an important consideration. I think that it's a little bit hard to include that directly in our assessments. I guess I might say that what we're trying to address here is kind of the relative risk across the state. And obviously there are differences in the heat island effect in different places. But these are all urban trees that we're looking at. So yeah, I wish that we could do a more fine scale analysis and say, in this particular retailer, we expect XYZ based on all of their site specific characteristics. But unfortunately, just at this scale, it's a little bit difficult to get that fine grained.
And if I could add just a note, Jessica, so one of the challenges we faced throughout the project, or have continued to face, we talked about it yesterday too, is all the site-specific factors that influence effects and outcomes. But because of the nature of the overall products at the end, we do have to try to evaluate statewide impacts, and that necessarily involves some amount of extrapolation and so forth. And so for we oftentimes face limitations where there might be good data for one particular location or several locations, but then trying to identify a procedure for extrapolating that ended up just either, in our opinion, introducing a lot of uncertainty or potentially introducing skewed outcomes or something. So we've dealt with that throughout, but it's definitely something to consider going forward as you're forecasting all these trends through the next 10 years and beyond.
Thank you. There were some additional sort of technical questions that Rachel, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, Rachel Malaric with the City of Los Angeles posed in the chat that it might make sense to get to now as well. She asked whether or not we considered potential future canopy and vegetated area and related water use was one of her questions. And I don't know if, Rachel, you are able to unmute yourself and speak, but there were other questions I thought that you had related to the analysis that might be good to discuss now.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Although I don't know that, I'll have to go back and look. I wrote them down because I wasn't sure I'd remember all of them as I was trying to absorb this really dense and fantastic presentation. I do want to just say, Joanna, you just said that this was intended to look at comparison across the state. So was the goal to see the impacts across our different regions or to kind of quantify the impacts as a whole so that we can address them? I want to make sure I'm clear on kind of the target of your modeling before I ask other questions, because that was a new way of thinking about it than I had been hearing it previously.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification, and apologies if I misspoke a little bit. I think the point is that we do certainly want to see like which parts of the state might be seeing increased risks, but our evaluation is not to say like each individual supplier, here's what we think are going to be the risks for your particular trees in each case. Because we simply, there are so many data gaps really, and so many site specific factors, as Eric was saying, that we're trying to, do our absolute best to get a sense across the whole state of where and how much risk there will be to trees.
Yeah, and obviously, I don't think any of us would anticipate that you are able to say specific to our jurisdiction, but I think it's helpful for us as practitioners to understand the scope of this project versus the future work that we may need to do in terms of ensuring that any decisions made around water use consider the other goals of the state regarding community resilience or health, which is, again, part of what we're thinking about in terms of our canopy and relates to the questions on urban heat island. I wouldn't expect this research team to kind of hit it all. You had a very specific task. But do want to think about how we can prioritize trees and urban park space as critical community centers and community infrastructure resources that we need to protect even as water becomes more scarce and we have to be more thoughtful about its use. So I did have questions around whether or not residential trees were at all represented, because the species present on residential properties sometimes is very different than what we have in the public right-of-way. And if you are only using public right-of-way inventories, and I'm sure you considered this as you developed it, but I was curious about your thought process there of how you would account for that species differential if you didn't have data on residential trees.
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. And unfortunately, we're limited to the data that we have. This is not only trees in public right-of-ways. It includes a lot of trees on people's front yards, but admittedly, it doesn't include a lot of backyard tree data. So I think, part of why we were comfortable with using this data is because it's the best that we have. And part of it is because for a lot of the analysis, we're grouping trees. It's their size that matters and kind of what type of tree they are. And so that, I think, is a little bit more generalizable from sort of the age of an area when trees were planted, and what types overall were planted. But yes, that is absolutely a limitation of this approach.
Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry, I did have one more question related to precipitation, because I did also hear in your presentation that the thought, when you looked at some of the projections, that there may not be an issue with the supplier's water use because, you know, that you saw turf in some areas, and then you might have, if you remove the turf amount, there might be plenty for trees, and or there might be cases where the annual precipitation makes up the difference, so that it doesn't impact the water use of the supplier. And so I'm wondering if any of your recommendations will include the acknowledgement that we don't anticipate. We have some years where we have significantly less rainfall to support our urban tree canopy population. It's something that we're thinking about in urban planning. You know, we want to make sure we're planning for a forest that will be using any potable water thoughtfully. But it definitely is should be part of the considerations. And then part of me jumps again to kind of behavior change and what our public will do, even if you have really great standards of, yeah, there's enough water for trees, what do the actions of the public look like when they hear things like there isn't enough, that we need to make significant conservation in the water that we're using?
Yeah, those are fabulous points. And I should be clear that we're not saying like, oh, hey, you get enough average annual precipitation to make up the difference, so like no worries. It's basically, again, thinking of the relative risk of different places. So if you think of somewhere in the Southwest desert region that gets very little precipitation input, versus, you know, somewhere like on the North Coast that gets quite a bit of precipitation. If we had the same difference in irrigation, we would say that there's more risk in the Southwest desert area than the North Coast area. Not saying that there would be no impact to trees, but that precipitation could help to reduce the risk.
And you included kind of maybe population density and part of the factors of whether or not that risk was a more high or low value. Was that part of the consideration at all? And then I can stop talking. There's so many other people here with questions. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are doing these calculations in gallons per capita per day. So that's kind of how we're incorporating population density.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I've tried to group those, all of the comments that appeared in the chat before we turn to the Q&A session. So maybe now let's turn to the folks with their hands raised. The first person I see is Fiona Sanchez.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. So I have a few questions, and some of it is just, I want to make sure I understand. So kind of touching on that precip point, I was just curious when you were calculating the water use objective and how much water is going to be applied, were you basing it off the DWR's approach that is also going to assume that we're automatically getting up to 25% precip? Was the spatial CIMAS data adjusted for that?
For our baseline calculations, we did not adjust the spatial CIMAS data. So we're, again, sort of using that potential effective precipitation as more of a risk factor than understanding the demand. Is that?
Sort of, so when you had your baseline saying, here's the objective and here's where agencies are, the objective that you're calculating is probably a little higher than we're actually going to be getting because you didn't factor out the precip.
Oh, for the objective calculations, that is, sorry, I'll have to turn that over to someone else because I did not actually calculate the objectives.
Hi, Fiona. I can attempt to address it, and then maybe Charlotte's team as well. So we've been calculating just various scenarios broadly and so forth throughout the contract, mostly in order to try to get all the data in order to figure out how to do this at the end for when the parameters are ultimately available. So within the objectives, the evaporation values that'll be in there, we'll just use what's provided to us by the state agencies.
Okay, great, thank you. And then Charlotte, I don't know if I can ask them. I have 3 other questions.
Sure.
One, I just want to clarify, because I know, and I think Rachel from City of LA mentioned this. So I know you've looked at the urban parks, but will the ultimate model include the fact that most of our residential customers, our single family, have a lot of trees? Is that included in the analysis?
Yes.
Okay, because
Yeah.
I thought I heard somebody say that we're only looking at dedicated meters, so I misunderstood. And that, okay, so that answers that. And then I also had just a kind of a question. I know you mentioned that you assumed all of broadleaf would lose their leaves, but you know, the part of the state that we're located in, when I look around, there's very few trees that have lost their leaves. So is that going to be factored into the final model, that there are some parts of the state where that really isn't predominant?
Oh, absolutely. So for every species we looked at, we actually classified it as evergreen or deciduous based on data from the select tree database. So there's certainly some uncertainty because different species lose their leaves at different times, but evergreen trees are considered to be transpiring year round in our
right.
model.
But I think what I'm saying is that a lot of the broadleaf trees where we are in Southern California don't lose their leaves because our climate is warmer.
Right. Yeah. For most species, they are either deciduous or evergreen. And so you may have more evergreen broadleaf species.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we definitely, all the broadleaf species were classified as evergreen or deciduous.
Okay. And then my last question, and this sort of, I just want to make sure I understand. I think one of the assumptions that I heard is that you're assuming that if turf were being replaced, it would be retrofitted with other landscape material, but that could be expensive, or if it's not, you know, people may just allow their turf to not, you know, to die, or they may put it just in some non-plant material. And so if you have a more heat island, would that affect the outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of 2 things there. One is that, you know, we're thinking about potential mitigation options, but of course, individual behaviors are going to determine outcomes, but those may be influenced by education. So there's a lot of uncertainty in what people will actually do to meet the objectives. The other thing is that at least from research done in our lab, we've found that the effects of replacing turf, at least with low water use vegetation, can largely be ameliorated by shading. So shading actually has a much greater effect on heat than what is underneath the tree canopy or other shading devices.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious about that because actually the Municipal Water District of Orange County did some really good analysis of their turf replacement program. And what they found is that on average, to replace turf about 1,000 square feet, it maybe costs, you know, $6,000 to $7,000 per site, and public funding customers are getting on average $3,800, but about $2,800 is the cost to the homeowner. And so, you know, not all homeowners, and it gets to this low income question that could be a concern that they're not able to do that. So that was why I was asking. But I do want to thank you for really, you know, explaining the model. It's obviously really complicated, and And I just want to let you know how much I appreciate the work that you've done on this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and that's a really important and valid concern, right? Because we want to make sure that, you know, people don't have that the only option they see to conserve water is not to simply turn off the tap and not irrigate their trees. There are a lot more cost-effective ways to sort of deep water trees without watering your turf as well, but making sure that people have the means to do that, I think, is extremely important. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank
and
you,
I'll just
Fiona.
quickly add, oh, sorry, Charlotte.
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to quickly add, Fiona, that the turf replacement, the cost of turf replacement, as well as potential outcomes of it are one of the mitigation considerations that are going into the evaluation for suppliers that would need to comply. It's one of the options to reduce demand. And we're not even able to talk about that today because that's a whole other component of the project led by Jonathan Kaplan. But the benefits and or costs assumed for that will be included in that component of the analysis, and then linking it up here with sort of the how it relates to mitigation and adaptation actions for turf replacement and implications for urban landscapes. We're going to make that connection as best as possible.
All right, thank you. Again, let us move to Stephanie Pensel with UCLA. Thanks for waiting, Stephanie.
Sure, thank you. To step back for a second on all of this work, there are a couple of irreducible factors. One is how much water we're going to have. So we can debate all of these questions quite extensively, but it will really depend a lot on precipitation. So, you know, that's something we actually can't affect. We, I think, need to prioritize water for indoor water needs because that's, you know, cooking, washing, and the rest is what humans need for survival. The second thing I want to point out is it's really in my research on trees, and I've been working on this since Mayor Villaraigosa's Million Tree Initiative. Some of you may remember that. Ultimately, many of these trees depend on residents to take care of them. And if you look around, you will see that there's a very patchy tree maintenance. And that's very, very important to understand. So those of us who really like trees and believe that trees have a lot of important attributes for cities, I think it's kind of irresponsible to not also think about how to municipalize the tree canopy. Because what we're doing is we're asking volunteers basically to take care of something that we think is cool. But we don't ask volunteers to take care of our sewage treatment plants or all kinds of other important infrastructure. So I don't think we've matured yet enough to really understand the consequences of thinking that this tree canopy cover is an urban infrastructure. So I just want to caution us a little bit about the tree enthusiasm and how very, very difficult it is to pull off. The number of trees that made it through that Million Tree Program initiative is like, you can practically count them on your two hands. I think we've gotten better at it, but it also offloads a whole set of responsibilities on the public. And the public may or may not have the capacity for taking care of those over the long term. Remember, trees are living infrastructure. They need that kind of maintenance. So I just listen to all of this and just want to have a little note of caution there, because I don't think we can assume people's enthusiasm over time for taking care of this infrastructure, nor that the water will be available for this kind of infrastructure. So I don't mean to be a downer on this, but I do think a little bit of realism is important. Thank you.
Thank you for those points, Stephanie. Let's see, there's no one else with their hand up, but there has been a lively response to a comment that Igor Lacan made earlier. I don't know if Igor, you're still on the phone or on the workshop and you would like to speak up to articulate it. But it seemed like there were quite a few people who were agreeing with what you said. All right, well, I will articulate this question and then we can address it, Eric and Joanna. He asked if it would be possible to start this analysis using idealized data. For example, streets with 100% of the planting spaces planted with low water use trees. In other words, how much water would be needed if every residential or commercial street had excellent canopy cover? So be interested in hearing the research team's thoughts on Igor's question.
I can start. So the short answer to that question is, would it be possible to start this analysis with idealized data? The answer is no, because within the Department of Finance framework, we are aligning this work with, from the economic standpoint, we have to consider what the baseline is, right? And so going forward 10 years, is the prospect of having streets with 100% of planted spaces with low water use trees likely to happen would need to be the assumption. And it would need to be the assumption for the future that then the objectives are compared to. It should be noted that across the complexity of this analysis for all the different sectors that urban water affects, that's not necessarily, it's hard to fit into the economic impact assessment sort of framework, right? And so that's why we're taking this sort of detailed look as much as possible so we can get the distributional impacts and so forth. For the environmental assessment, environmental analysis here, there is some more flexibility to talk about mitigation and adaptation actions and thinking about some of those scenarios. So to your point, there are many, I think, communities throughout the state that are looking at these sorts of opportunities in various ways and shapes and forms. But within the context of the environmental impact and economic impact assessment, where our team has a role, we have to think about what is likely to occur and then assess impacts upon that. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Great, thank you for taking a stab at that. Igor Lachman, UC Cooperative Extension. My point was simply to sort of spur thinking about where it is we want to be, given that we have pretty large disparities across the state in urban canopy cover. I think it might be useful to try to say, well, we would like the communities that don't have tree canopy cover now to have some. What would that mean for the water consumption? And by the way, I'm not advocating for some kind of endless water application, but I am thinking if we want, especially some of the inland communities, to have greater tree canopy, maybe we will need to invest in some kind of recycled water or some other sort of new water infrastructure. And I think it might be useful to at least have some idea of what it would take to do that. Because, and this was sort of my second point, it is possible, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but it is possible for new regulations to sort of bake in the existing disparities or to kind of help solidify existing disparities. So I'm just thinking, is there a way to make sure we're not headed down that road? And again, thank you very much for taking my question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one thing I think that might provide some context is just sort of re-articulating how this framework will work. Very early on in the presentation, Karina sort of showed that slide, of what the calculations would be to come up with a outdoor residential water use budget, that then would be added to this objective, right? And that's based on the landscape area within the service area of each of the urban retail water suppliers. And so that's sort of a key input variable when it comes to calculating these outdoor budgets. And so I guess in sort of thinking what it would mean to conduct this analysis using idealized data, like in a way, like that's what our ETF factors are supposed to represent, right? This regulation is supposed to be for the efficient use of water. And so when the State Water Board in coordination with the department, adopts, these standards, they are to be for the efficient use of water, and embedded in that ETF value ought to be, exactly, what you're articulating there. What is our collective vision as a state moving forward? What do we, think our communities ought to be, vegetated with? So I think that is the goal of this rulemaking. And we would be comparing what the baseline conditions are, to the efficiency standards that are adopted.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. There were quite a few other questions in the chat. I'll bring up a couple more of them. I did want to note that we will do our best to make sure that the questions that are not answered today, as part of this webinar, which we will be posting the slides and a recording on our website, the questions that we don't answer, verbally, we will, develop an FAQ document. I wanted to flag some of the questions just quickly that were raised by Amy Talbot with the Regional Water Authority. She asked, how does the landscape designation, tree canopy, turf, non-landscape performed through this study relate to the landscape designation, irrigable, irrigated, et cetera, of the residential standards analysis by Eagle Aerial and DWR? Are they coordinated or a completely separate process? Good question.
Great question.
Why don't you go ahead and take it, Joanna?
Sure. So they are completely separate processes. I guess that's sort of the basic answer to the question. We unfortunately don't have access to the actual areas designated as irrigable, irrigated, and irrigable, non-irrigated. Yes. Okay. So the process that we used for determining NDVI also doesn't give us like a shapefile output. It gives us a total vegetated area output. So we've been able to compare those numbers and found that they're actually quite comparable, but the process to determine them was entirely separate.
We are using at last similar, the same boundary information, but that was a challenge, getting the exact boundary information that the department was using and reconciling it with the boundary information that had been reported to the water board. So there have been some data hurdles that we've been sort of leaping over as this process has been carried out. Let's see, another question from Amy. She was asking if the team could provide more detail on how the tree mix for each service area is calculated. Is the mix calculated at the service level or neighborhood by neighborhood? If you guys could speak to that in the last 2 minutes, that would be great.
Sure. So it is the vast majority of the tree inventory data that we were able to use. We don't actually have the tree data itself. It's aggregated to the zip code level, and our colleagues were able to then subset it by our residential areas. But so it's essentially it's at the zip code level yeah. So unfortunately, we can't really look at individual neighborhoods, and that is, again, a limitation.
Okay, well, in our last minute, why don't we go to our next slide and close up. Again, we'll upload the presentations and the recording to the website. We will be scheduling additional meetings, so please sign up for our listserv, stay informed. We look forward to continued collaboration and coordination and engagement with you all. Thank you so much for attending our workshop today. And then, of course, we'll be starting the rulemaking sometime this spring. So last slide, our next slide. Here's where to find more information. The State Water Board's Water Conservation Portal, sort of our landing page. We have a general web page for learning more about the legislation 606 and 1668. We also have information about the rulemaking process. This is where the slides will be located. And then there are a number of really great resources on DWR's website. Last slide. So that's it from us. Thank you all so much. Thank you, research team. Appreciate all of your time, and we'll look forward once again to continue to work with all of you. So have a great rest of your Friday, everybody. Have a good weekend.